Something very interesting. Let's talk some anime, everyone. Let's talk some anime. And did you know that there is a British connection with Studio Ghibli? It's quite interesting. But yes, there is a British connection between the United Kingdom and Hayao Miyazaki. And let's see, Archie Talks Anime put out a very interesting video about it. Let me go over to my window capture here and switch over to that. And we'll have ourselves a look-see and learn a bit about the British connection with Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli. Made it for maybe 5 minutes. Well, hey, we're glad to have you for 5 minutes, Phalanx. Hope you're having a good day. Anyways, this should be interesting.
It's 100% true.
And it would help if I turn the audio
You might
on.
be surprised to learn that Great Britain shaped the future of Studio Ghibli in a massive way, but it's 100% true. In this video, I'll explain how 2 separate trips to the UK became life-changing experiences for Ghibli co-founder Hayao Miyazaki, and why the anime icon holds Britain in such a high regard. He was still a young man when he first came to the UK.
Avid Anglophile.
However, Miyazaki's
Good
love
for him.
affair with all things British actually began years earlier when he was still a student. During his school days, he
Working hard
became
on
a
a
keen
driver's
reader of
tan.
children's
Stay
literature
safe out there.
and was fond of British authors like Rosemary Sutcliffe and Philippa Pearce. To this day, many of Miyazaki's favourite writers hail from the UK. When he was looking for inspiration ahead of the first official Studio Ghibli film, 1986's Laputa Castle in the Sky, he decided it was time to jet off to the UK and see the place for himself. Sadly, he arrived at a time when tensions were high and violent clashes were breaking out between the police and a group
bad
of
luck.
men desperately trying to save their way of life. Described by the BBC as the most bitter industrial dispute in British history, the miners' strikes of 1984 changed the United Kingdom forever. In the mid-1970s, the coal mining industry was booming and the government of the day was actually encouraging people to switch careers. Such was the demand for miners. Pit workers up and down the country were completely blindsided when the government suddenly changed its tune. The people in power had decided that a lot of mines were no longer economically viable. Their closure would mean thousands of job losses and the total decimation of communities that relied on the mines to survive. When talk of mass strikes first began, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher initially backed down, though Thatcher's Conservative governments saw the coal mining industry as something that was doomed to fail. The trouble began when Thatcher appointed a Scottish-born American
except it
businessman
has it, the
called
world
Ian
still needs
McGregor
coal.
as the new chairman of the National Coal Board. Within a year, McGregor had closed as many as 20 coal mines across the UK, which equated to a loss of 20,000 jobs. At this point, the miners who were still in the job felt as though they had to make their move while they still could. So, on the 5th of March 1984, workers at the Cortonwood Colliery in Yorkshire downed tools in protest, beginning a chain reaction that swept across the country. Within a week, over half of Britain's miners were on strike. 3 months later, a clash between police and striking miners took place at the Orgrave coking plant in South Yorkshire in what became known as the Battle of Orgrave. Officers on horseback charged a blockade of miners, and it turned into absolute carnage, with men being beaten and trampled. Around 5,000 police went up against
Yes, because let's
approximately
not
the same
give
amount of
miners what they want.
so
Let's
this
just
was far
trample
from a
them and
small
beat them
skirmish.
publicly.
The shocking footage was shown on TV stations around the world, including in Japan, where it was seen by none other than Hayao Miyazaki. Speaking to the British newspaper The Guardian, Miyazaki revealed that he was deeply affected by what he saw. He said, "I admired those men. I admired the way they battled to save their way of life. Many people of my generation see the miners as a symbol, a dying breed of fighting men. Now they are gone." One of the most important figures during the strikes was a man called Arthur Scargill, who became president of the National Union of Mine Workers in 1982. He was a staunch opponent of Thatcher's government, and he knew what was coming when the Prime Minister appointed Ian McGregor as the chairman of the National Coal Board. McGregor oversaw massive changes to the steel industry that cost thousands of jobs, and Scargill's aim was to stop that from happening again. Scargill's words inspired miners up and down the country to stand up against McGregor and Thatcher. While some carried on working to support their families, Scargill had near total support in Yorkshire, North East England, Scotland and South Wales. Miyazaki decided that he wanted to see whales in person when he visited the UK prior to making Castle in the Sky. He said, "I really admired the way the miners' unions fought to the very end for their jobs and communities, and I wanted to reflect the strength of those communities in my film. I saw so many places with abandoned machinery, abandoned mines. The fabric of industry was there, but no people. It made a strong impression on me." It wasn't only the plight of the miners that inspired Miyazaki. If you watch Castle in the Sky, it's clear that the rows of terraced houses that make up Pazu's hometown are based on those found in mining communities in Wales and across the rest of the UK. Miyazaki was also in awe of the striking landscapes that he encountered while visiting the valleys of Rhondda, and Powys Castle is said to have inspired Laputa itself. Castle in the Sky is essentially a love letter to Wales and the working class communities that were the beating heart of Britain's Industrial Revolution. The UK and the plight of its miners became the basis for the first ever Studio Ghibli film, but the secret links between Great Britain and Japan's top animation house do not end there. While this trip to the UK had a big impact on Miyazaki, the same thing happened when he returned to the country many years later.
So part 2, Miyazaki and the Floating Ladies.
In 2019, Japan's public broadcaster NHK began airing the documentary series 10 Years with Hayao Miyazaki, which gave fans a fascinating insight into the life of the anime icon over the course of a decade.
A very good series, by the way, and I believe it is still available for streaming on the NHK World website. Yes, it's quite good. If you haven't seen it already, just do a Google search for NHK World Japan. Or even Google 10 Years with Hayao Miyazaki. And yeah, go check it out. It's good. It's really good.
One episode, Miyazaki revealed that he returned to the UK in 2006 when he was working on the film Ponyo, a loose adaptation of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. During this trip, he made a visit to the London art gallery Tate Britain, and it turned into another life-altering experience for the Ghibli co-founder. Miyazaki was fascinated by the work of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of English painters and poets founded in 1848. The group came together to promote a return to the abundant detail and intense colours of Quattrocento Italian art, something they felt had gotten lost over time. Miyazaki was in awe of their work, particularly John Everett Malay's Ophelia. The attention to detail amazed the anime creator and actually made him feel like a bit of a fraud. He said, "I thought my work is shoddy compared to those artists. I was just astonished. At that point, it became clear to me, our animation style could not go on as before."
I mean, that's sort of the dilemma, the struggle with a lot of artists, is to make one's mark in the creative world. And yet at the same time, one cannot help but stand upon the shoulders of giants that came before. And so often artists, they sort of face a fork in the road, as it were. Do you pay deference to what has come before? Or do you either ignore or even perhaps criticize or attempt to tear down what has come before, deconstruct it? Yes, quite the tightrope you walk as an artist.
Ghibli had been using CGI in their films to varying degrees since 1997's Princess Mononoke, but this visit to the Tate made Miyazaki want to return to his roots. The work of Malay and his peers changed his outlook on animation, reminding him that it's supposed to be art. As a result, he shunned CGI for Ponyo and went old school. The film was
It was probably a better film for it, to be perfectly honest. Those that rise from the challenge become far more from it, indeed.
Made using 170,000 hand-drawn frames, a new record for a Miyazaki film. During his promotional tour of Ponyo, Miyazaki said, "I believe that making animation with pencils is the only way for us to survive. Everybody is discarding pencils. Because of that, at least we should not lose track of ourselves. I want to continue to work in such circumstances." Now, a lot of people tend to dismiss Ponyo, but no matter what your opinion on the film is, you have to admit that it looks fantastic. From
Oh,
the
yes.
magical underwater scenes to its depiction of everyday life on land, it really is a feast for the eyes. And if you watch
Yes.
Ponyo back knowing that Miyazaki had an epiphany when he saw Ophelia in person, you will notice that the painting actually influenced the film in a more direct way. In the scene where Ponyo's parents, Grandmama and Fujimoto, discuss the dangerous imbalance that was created when Ponyo turned human, you can clearly see that the positioning of Ponyo's mother as she pokes her head out of the water is a nod to Ophelia. Of course, the scenes being depicted here are very different. Ophelia is a painting of the tragic character of the same name from Shakespeare's Hamlet. In the play, the young Danish noblewoman is driven to madness by Hamlet's actions, and she ends up drowning in a river after falling into the water from a nearby tree. At this point, she is incapable of her own distress, according to Queen Gertrude, who reveals to Ophelia's brother that she just floated mermaid-like in the water, singing songs until her clothes became too heavy and dragged her down to a watery death. That's precisely why the young woman shown in the painting doesn't seem to be that bothered by her situation and almost has a smile on her face. Both Ophelia and Grandmama have an air of tranquility to them in these images, despite, or perhaps in spite of the impending doom that they're both facing. Miyazaki reportedly brought a poster version of the famous Malay painting back to Japan with him and hung it on the wall of his workshop at Ghibli HQ so he could look at it while he was working on Ponyo. What's interesting is that another director working in the same building would soon discover his own love for the UK.
British clouds just hit different.
Miyazaki isn't the only Studio Ghibli director who has been inspired by the United Kingdom. Hiromasa Yonebayashi, who directed the Ghibli films The Secret World of Arrietty and When Marnie Was There, fell in love with something that we Brits love to moan about: the weather. But how did this happen? Well, when
ironic.
Miyazaki announced that he would be retiring after The Wind Rises, Ghibli's production division was essentially disbanded. Of course, Miyazaki would later change his mind and come out of retirement to the surprise of absolutely no one, though by that stage, Ghibli producer Yoshiaki Nishimura had founded his own studio and obtained the rights to adapt the classic children's book The Little Broomstick by Mary Stuart. Yonebayashi was brought on board to direct, and he quickly realised that a trip to England was going to be necessary in order to capture the feeling of Stuart's book, which is set in rural Shropshire. It's the story of a plain, lonely girl named Mary Smith. She's spending the holidays with an old aunt in the countryside when she discovers a strange black cat and a magic broomstick. It all sounds pretty typical, but what makes Stuart's book so great is the way that she captures what it really feels like to be bored as a child in England. The opening paragraph finishes with, "Nothing could have been more depressing," she thought. To be plain, to be 10, and to be alone, staring out of her bedroom window on a grey autumn day, and to be called Mary Smith. Stuart describes the climate and the landscape of that part of the UK beautifully, wet weather and all. In fact, it was the English clouds that caught the eye of Yonebayashi during his research trip. He said, "Clouds in Britain were very different from Japanese clouds. They seemed very close and they went on forever. They really stirred the imagination. I felt like those clouds had been an inspiration for British writers to create lots of fantasy works. It looked as if some hidden castle was
Or
about
to just
to emerge
complain
from
about the
them."
weather.
This was Yonebayashi's first time in the UK, and even though he was there for work, he was having a blast. Speaking to the British press, he revealed that he loved the landscapes around Shropshire and that he was fascinated by the variety of flora and fauna. We were familiar with English scenery through such works as Peter Rabbit and Thomas the Tank Engine. What was different from what we imagined was the colours of the trees and leaves and flowers. So many different tones and shades. The director and his producer went to a bunch of different manor houses in the area, and they were even seen asking locals for tips on the best gardens to visit.
Which I'm sure that the locals must have been absolutely tickled that they were asking about that, because if there's one thing that the people in Great Britain, they love to talk about the weather, but they also love to go on and on and on about their gardens. They love their gardens. So they just, if it's not gardens, it's football or something else, or perhaps cricket. But yeah, no, they ingratiated themselves with the locals quite well when they started asking about those. So good for them. Good for them. Yeah.
Kobayashi spoke enthusiastically about the top-notch hospitality that he received during his trip, and he even seemed to enjoy the food. He said, "We had an English breakfast every morning and it was fantastic."
Oh, yes. Right here, chat. This is a proper breakfast here. You've got eggs. You've got back bacon. You've got, looks like you've got some blood sausage. You've got beans. You've got toast. And you've got sausages. Yes. But the only thing that seems to be missing are the grilled tomatoes. The little grilled tomatoes. God, that looks so good. I had that recently. It was little Christmas present I prepared for my mother and father. Cooked everyone in the house proper English breakfast. And yeah, it was good. Even managed to find a can of Heinz beans. Yeah, it's good to have beans on toast, especially with a little sprinkling of cheese, a little bit of shredded cheese. That was quite good.
Now, I know what you're thinking. A tourist who loves British weather and British food? That's too good to be true. But believe it or not, British cuisine is actually pretty well thought of in Japan, thanks to Nozomu Hayashi's bestseller
Fish and chips. I mean, what's not to love, yeah? That's so good. Squeeze a little bit of lemon on top. And hey presto, it's perfect.
book, England is Delicious. The author lived in the UK for 3 years and he developed...
I mean, they're not wrong. Food in England has typically gotten a bad rap for a long time, but that sort of reputation is quite undeserved. The food is actually quite delicious in many places that you go to, not just London, but there's a variety of different inns and small family-owned restaurants and boutique establishments that you can visit all throughout the country. That they're fantastic. The food is fantastic. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's so good. I really don't know what people are on about the food being bland or tasting horrible. It's actually quite good, especially when you really give it a chance. I think it's just tired old tropes and stereotypes at best, and perhaps at worst, a bit of anti-Anglo xenophobia.
The love for British eating and drinking culture in that time, which inspired him to write the book. According to Hayashi, the book was an easy sell back home. Speaking to The Telegraph about its popularity, he said, "Basically, Japanese people love England. We like English culture and English things." So, seeing as...
And you know something, Japan? We love you. We love your people. We love your food. We love your culture, your anime, your goods. Honestly, Anglo-Japanese relations, it's like the perfect basis for a bilateral treaty. But yes, no, believe me, if the Japanese love England and the English people, then England loves them right back. Believe me, especially the younger generations, because, I mean, what's not to love, yeah?
Grew up in a country full of Anglophiles, it's really not that surprising that Miyazaki was influenced by the UK at several different points during his life and career. The works of British authors inspired him as a child, and he would of course end up adapting one himself with Howl's Moving Castle, written by English fantasy novelist Diana Wynne Jones. According to Jones, while her beloved story and the Ghibli movie it inspired are different in many ways, she was struck by how Miyazaki seemed to understand her work like nobody else ever has.
I've loved his work for about 20 years now, long before I knew he was going to make a film of mine. And when we met the other night, we discovered, at least I discovered, that he understood my books in a way that nobody else has ever done. It really was quite striking.
That's incredible. When you meet an author and it's just, you get each other like that. And it's rare that an author is comfortable with any sort of divergence from their source material. But when it's done with such respect and such reverence as Miyazaki does, it's pretty hard to object to that.
Miyazaki has also adapted the work of British authors in manga form. In 2004, he came to the UK to give Jones a private viewing of Hal's Moving Castle, and during this trip, he decided to visit a place called Tynemouth on England's northeast coast. He was drawn to this quaint little seaside town because of a short story called Blackham's Wimpy, written by local author Robert Westall. It's the tale of an airplane radio operator who experiences a haunting while on a dangerous mission over Germany during World War II. Miyazaki's father was the owner of a company that built rudders for planes, so he's always been fascinated by aircraft and flying in general, a common theme that runs throughout his films. As such, he fell in love with Blackham's Wimpy when it was published in Japanese back in 1990, and he wanted to see the place that the author of the story called home. Miyazaki created a stunning watercolour manga called A Trip to Tynemouth after seeing the area, which is half an adaptation of Blackham's Wimpy and half a fictional account of his visit. The Ghibli co-founder portrays himself as an anthropomorphic pig in the story, and Westall himself even appears as a talking terrier. It's beautifully illustrated and it makes for a fascinating read, though I'm not going to reveal too much about it here because I plan to make a full video about this in the near future. So if you're interested in learning more about Miyazaki's lesser known work, make sure to subscribe for that. Suffice to say that this was yet another meaningful trip to the UK for Miyazaki, who seems to connect with Britain on a personal level. Despite being enemies during World War II, the two island nations actually have a lot in common, both in terms of history and culture. On top of a shared obsession with tea, Japanese and British people put a lot of emphasis on being polite. We both apologise far more than we really should.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
I am very, very sorry.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
And queuing is practically an art form in both countries.
The Wimbledon Tennis Championships in London provides an annual example of British queuing at its best.
Despite the great distance between the two...
I don't know how they do it, though. I don't know. Maybe I've been living in America for too long, but I've just grown to loathe queuing. I personally can't stand it. It's got to be something that is a really big deal for me to consider queuing up for it. Otherwise, I'm just going to come back another time. Or it's probably not important in the long run, and I just forget about the whole thing. You know, I don't think there's certainly no restaurant that I've ever encountered that's worth queuing up for. Amusement park attractions, I mean, if it's a short queue, it's all right. Yeah, there's just not very much that I'm willing to queue up for anymore. I look at it, and just from my own perspective, it's just no. An experience of some kind. I mean, it's got to be something that's really big and historical. I would think about it, but even then, you can always catch the VOD later, it seems. And maybe that's a bit of a sad statement on humanity's part. The loss of, experiencing something like that live. I don't know. There's not much that I'd be willing to queue up for anymore. Just doesn't seem worth it.
Countries, assimilation can be relatively simple, which perhaps explains why Miyazaki has such an affinity for Great Britain. One thing that's certain is that Miyazaki's interactions with the UK helped to shape the future of Ghibli on more than one occasion, and that's something that British fans of the studio can certainly be proud of. Thanks for watching, everyone, and let me know in the comments if there are any British books that you would like to see Miyazaki adapt if he ends up making another film. Personally, I'd love to see his take on something by Roald Dahl, an author that he's very much aware of. Miyazaki has revealed that the ghost plane scene in Porco Rosso was actually inspired by a passage from Dahl's They Shall Not Grow Old, a tale from his short story collection Over to You. Dahl was actually in the Royal Air Force during World War II, and he wrote a bunch of stories about pilots based on his real-life experiences. But honestly, I'd be thrilled just to know that Miyazaki was going to make one more movie, whether it was set in Britain or not. Cheers guys, I'll see you in the next one. Cheerio.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool. That one gets a like. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. If you have any thoughts, questions, or ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. You can also follow me on Twitter @LordRexworth for more updates and behind-the-scenes content. And if you want to support the channel, check out my Coffee or Throne pages. Links are in the description. Finally, be sure to visit lordrexworth.com and follow me across all platforms. That's lordrexworth.com. Until next time, I wish you all the best, and God bless.